Welcome to UOTODAY. I'm Paul Peppis, Director of the Oregon Humanities Center. My guest today is Damian Radcliffe, the Carolyn S. Chambers Professor in Journalism at the University of Oregon. He's an affiliate faculty member in the Middle East and North African Studies program and the Agora Journalism Center, as well as a research associate in the Center for Science Communication Research. His research focuses on the usage of social media and wider trends in local media, technology, and the business of media and journalism innovation. Before joining the UO in 2015, Professor Radcliffe worked for 4 years in commercial radio in the UK, 8 years with the BBC, 4 years at the UK communications regulator Ofcom, and 3 years for Qatar's Ministry of Information and Communications Technology. Radcliffe continues to be an active journalist. He has been a columnist for the leading tech outlet ZDNet and the Donald W. Reynolds Journalism Institute at the University of Missouri. He also writes regular features for the International Journalists Network, What's New in Publishing, journalism.co.uk, and other outlets. Radcliffe writes about digital trends, social media, technology, the business of media, and the evolution and practice of journalism. Thanks, Damian, for coming on the show. It's great to have you with us.
Thanks for inviting me.
So first, tell us a little bit about your background. You clearly have an English accent, so tell us about yourself.
Yes, I do, and the English teeth to go with it. So I think your introduction really nicely set the scene. Really, I mean, I started my career in commercial radio, as you said, and then I think one of the things that's really interesting about my kind of resume, my CV, and probably one of the things that's quite unique is that I've worked across all media platforms and also across all sectors. So I started in commercial radio, then I moved to radio, television, this newfangled thing called online and new media. But I've also worked in print and in magazines and done that for commercial media, public media, NGOs, regulators, and now academia. So I think that gives me quite a unique perspective in terms of the media landscape and the kind of different facets that contribute to it.
So what led to your interest in journalism? Why did you become a journalist?
That's a great question. If you ask my mother, she will tell you that as soon as I could lift my head up, I would be poking my head around the cot and wanting to kind of see what was going on. So I think she'd say I was curious or nosy pretty much kind of from the get-go. And I think that's probably true. I think that's what kind of incentivized me to kind of to do journalism. And one of the reasons why I still love doing it is meeting new people, learning new things, being exposed to new ideas and places. And it was something I'd kind of always wanted to do. I remembered when we got this this date in the diary, in the calendar, that I had at middle school edited the middle school paper. I edited the yearbook when I was at high school, and also did a satirical magazine which was called The Bishop's Underpants. The school was called Bishop Luffer. And I had always kind of wanted to do it, but was also a little bit resistant to it. I mean, it's probably hard to tell looking at me now, but as a teenager, I was all about sports. And then I dislocated my knee when I was about sort of 14, 15, and had to suddenly find a new hobby. And I chanced upon this thing that I think is pretty unique to the UK, doesn't really exist in the US, called hospital radio. So the local hospital in the town in which I lived, which was also the same hospital I was born in, had a radio station, and it piped news and information and took music requests from patients, and I got involved in doing that and kind of really got the bug, if you like.
Fascinating, fascinating. So tell us about the work you did in the UK with community radio and with the BBC.
Yeah, so I mean, that was a really interesting initiative to kind of work on. I worked for an NGO at the time called CSV, Community Service Volunteers, now called Volunteering Matters, and it's a large non-profit organization that encourages people to play an active role in their communities, and by giving their time as the kind of primary mechanism to do that. And I managed a partnership between CSV and the BBC, and in particular BBC Local Radio, so 36 local radio stations across England, and we would produce broadcasts, events, do kind of various kind of outreach activity designed to inspire people to give their time and get more involved in their community. And that kind of manifested itself in a number of different ways, from encouraging people to take up learning opportunities like learning new languages and so forth. But some of the most interesting stuff was around, we had a campaign called Dare to Care, which encouraged people to volunteer with organizations that were tackling child poverty issues, and the goal was to recruit 10,000 new volunteers, which we did. And then back in 2005, which was my maths is going to fail me now, 60th anniversary of the end of World War II. We trained up 1,700 volunteer story gatherers across the UK to talk to the older generation about their experience of living through World War II. That might have been in the service, or it might have been as children, or kind of in other roles. And their experience was then captured as part of a national archive, which now sits with the British Library. And those 1,700 volunteers captured 17,000 stories as part of this archive. And it was an amazing project to work on.
So what led to your work in Qatar, and what did you do there?
Yeah, that probably seems like a bit of a leap, but I went from working for that non-profit to working for the communications regulator in the UK, Ofcom, which is the sort of the FCC equivalent. And then, of course, in 2011, the Arab Spring happened. And there was a huge discussion about the role that technology was playing in that, and in particular of social media as a driver for socioeconomic change and political change. You know, we heard phrases that have been slightly overstated about the Twitter revolution in Egypt and Tunisia and elsewhere. But there was really a paucity of data and information about how social media and technology was being used in that region. And the Qatar government, like a number of other governments in that region, recognized that it needed to change and kind of pivot its economy away from petrochemical emphasis to create a knowledge-based economy, and that digital and technology would kind of underpin that. So they set up a research program, or wanted to set up a research program, exploring how people were using technology in Qatar, but also regionally and then internationally, and to use that to inform policy making and indeed investment decisions in the country. And I was very fortunate that I was able to get that gig and do that for 3 years.
So, okay, so you've worked in the UK, you've worked in Qatar, and then you now decide you're going to go into the academy. What brought you to the academy?
Yeah, it was kind of a combination of a number of different factors. I mean, I'd started to do a lot more research work along with kind of ongoing continued journalistic work whilst working for regulators, because they want research to inform their decisions and their policy making. I mean, good regulators operate in that way. So I'd started to get research experience and a bit of a research profile, continued to work as a journalist, but I was also very conscious of the fact that the thing I enjoyed most in the sort of 20 years kind of prior to that point was mentoring other people. I've been very fortunate to hire and work with a bunch of amazing young journalists and strategists and policymakers and so forth. And that was the thing I enjoyed the most. And I saw a really strong synergy with that with teaching. And I also saw that when I look at kind of key points in my own life, I've been given very lucky breaks by people who've kind of backed me, given me a chance, mentored me, taken me under their wing. And I believe in an element of karma and of giving this back. So it was a kind of combination of, I've benefited from this. I've also really enjoyed doing this. And how do we kind of merge the two? And the academy feels like a great place to be able to do that.
So what attracted you to U of O and the School of Journalism and Communication?
Well, the weather, obviously, as a British person. But beyond that, I think the school has this amazing blend of kind of practitioners and career faculty and tenured and tenure track staff doing amazing research work across such a wide variety of different areas. And whenever I have a conversation with one of my colleagues, I'm incredibly inspired and fired up by what they're doing. And that happened kind of from day one. And I continue to feel that sense of kind of energy and invigoration sort of 8 years on. And the school has also continued to grow. It's expanded very rapidly during that time. We've also merged or kind of branched out into areas like immersive media and games and gaming studies. And the lines between traditional media disciplines have also begun to break down, kind of more so than ever. So all of those kind of factors just said, this is a really exciting place to be. There's a really nice West Coast sensibility that kind of chimes very much with my kind of philosophy and vibe and how I grew up. And then there's this amazing, beautiful campus. The first time I set foot in it, I was like, this is like walking into a movie set. And I still feel that.
It was a movie.
It was a movie set. Well, yeah, maybe not Animal House, but yeah, it's an incredibly inspirational kind of space and place to be, both in terms of just the people, but the general kind of atmosphere. And I love the fact that there is such emphasis on kind of independence and freedom, and that I've basically been allowed to to some extent, kind of write my own ticket in terms of what I explore and what I teach. And that's an incredible privilege, and one I'm very fortunate to have.
So you have worked on, in not-for-profit radio, but you've also worked in commercial radio.
Yes, I have.
So let's talk a little bit
And
about
I left commercial radio because I objected to how much money they were making and how little they were paying for that stuff.
So you've started to answer my question. So to talk a little bit about what you think are the most significant changes that have happened in the business of media over your career.
Yeah, so I mean, it's unrecognizable from how it was when I kind of started out in 1995. I was a student at Oxford University studying history, and I spent most of my time not studying history, but setting up and running a campus radio station, which was kind of a new concept in the UK. And when I talk to students about this, I have a presentation where I talk about what's changed since I started out. And I now realize that, of course, I started working before most of them were born, which is a very sobering thought. And I'll point out, well, I got my first job. I was given a pager, and I thought I was the man because I had a pager. And this is pre-mobile, pre-social networks, pre-really kind of like video on demand. It was not that long ago that Netflix sent you DVDs in the post, rather than it being an enormous and incredible content powerhouse. And so the landscape has just changed dramatically, both in terms of where we get our content from, how we pay for it, but also in terms of the opportunities that there are for content creators and storytellers to be able to just go down a myriad of different paths to ply their trade. So
talk a little bit about how those changes have impacted the practices of journalism.
Yeah, it's impacted it hugely. I mean, one thing I didn't mention in that last answer was also, of course, the business model has also changed dramatically, with so much of the money that traditionally used to go to journalism now migrating towards platforms and the duopoly of Facebook and Google. And that's presented a whole bunch of kind of different challenges. So, I mean, so the big changes are kind of fewer people working in newsrooms, but also more places in which you can work, including kind of digital-only outlets, the opportunity to do your own thing, which I think that kind of emergence of the creator economy and kind of journalist as entrepreneur, media entrepreneur, I think is a really, really interesting space, and that students need to be factoring in from day one into the skill set that they are developing. And of course, the ways in which we tell stories and communicate them are also different. So we're creating content that works for social, that works for mobile, that is kind of often more bite-sized or atomized than it used to be. Long form is not dead, but short form is incredibly popular. And sometimes there are ways in which you can present long form content by stealth in sort of short form. So there was a good example when Snapchat first started to kind of pick up about probably 7-8 years ago, and Vice at the time was kind of having a real moment with their videos, really spoke to young audiences in terms of its style and subject matter. But people wouldn't necessarily watch a 15-20 minute documentary on their website or on YouTube, but they would watch 30-second videos and just kind of scroll through it. And so it was just a way of almost by stealth introducing people to kind of more complex topics and kind of hooking and bringing them in. And we have to be constantly across how trends are changing and shaping how audiences behave, and then as content creators, responding to that and going where the audience is and meeting their needs.
So you say the audience, but it seems to me that we only have audiences now.
Yes.
And
true.
that it used to be that there were in Britain there was the BBC, and in the U.S. there were 4 channels.
Yeah.
And everybody would watch those news channels every night. Everybody in the country would be watching them.
Yes.
We're in a very different place now.
Absolutely.
And one of the issues is sort of decline in public trust for journalism and the media. So how are, you've described, what you just described sounds fairly cool, but there's a kind of dark side to everything you've just described. So obviously the old media has been scrambling to adjust to this, but these changes have had detrimental effects on our public discourse, et cetera. So absolutely. Tell us about where you're at on that, and what are the things that are happening out there that give you hope in response to all this?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, there is plenty, I think, to give you hope, but there's also plenty of reason to be despondent, and so it is very much kind of 6 of one, half a dozen of the other. I often say to our students, it's a great time for journalism, but not necessarily a great time to be a journalist. Right now, we have access to so much content and so much great journalism, but the economics of the industry remain very challenging, and that's a real issue in terms of salaries and then kind of like other elements that are part of the kind of package of care and work and expectations from an employer. And the picture you've described is a global one. So we see through things like Edelman's Trust Barometer, which covers 28 countries around the world, pretty much everywhere, year on year, trust is falling in terms of across institutions, including media, government, and kind of other public bodies and outlets. And redressing that is hard. And it's hard partly because our media model is so partisan. I think that is one of the biggest problems. I mean, you pointed to like this sort of golden halcyon age of like 4 networks, a shared truth. We all watched the same things and we were exposed to the same news and information. And now there is a myriad of different sources that you can go to. Some are more reputable than others. And we see that with the trust data. I mean, if you look at kind of Gallup's data on trust in journalism, there are huge discrepancies based on your political affiliation in terms of the level of trust that you have in news media. And so addressing that is incredibly important. And I think there's a number of different kind of steps to take to that with that. And one of which is we need to do a much better job of explaining what journalism is, how it works, and through that helping people to understand the complexities of editorial decision making. What are some of the differences between opinion versus fact or opinion versus reporting, because in the cable news era those things are very confused. And we also have to look at kind of those business models which are very much driven by conflict, particularly again, just going back to cable news. That it's a question of who shouts the loudest is the truth that I believe. And we need to do a lot more as a society to talk about how journalism works, why it needs to be supported, and also to try and find kind of more common ground in terms of the discussions that we're having on important topics.
So last year you were a faculty fellow with UO's Agora Journalism Center.
Yeah.
And I think you could argue that the Agora Center is one of the things that it's interested in is responding to this problem that you're talking about.
It is.
Tell us about the Agora Center and tell us how you've participated in it.
Yeah, so the Agora Center is based up at UO Portland, run by my amazing colleagues Regina Lawrence and Andrew de Vigal. And it started about sort of 8-9 years ago, initially to look at journalism innovation and civic engagement. And it's pivoted a little bit since then to talk more about civic health and local news and the kind of synergy between those. And I've been really fortunate that I've been a faculty fellow there 3 times, and that has enabled me to pursue a number of different research projects, very much focused, the first 2 at least, on what was happening specifically here in the Pacific Northwest. So I wrote a report about local journalism in the Pacific Northwest, who's creating it, shifts in audiences, behavior, and so forth, but then looking at transferable lessons from that. And then a couple of years after that, I did a follow-up where I brought 28 different media companies from Oregon State and Washington State together in a room to talk about what was happening across their industry, and then brought students and faculty to be part of that conversation. Many of those journalists had never met, many of those outlets had never met before, and it was really interesting to have a combination of the Seattle Times on the one hand, and then somebody like Bike Portland, which is not necessarily an outlet you would think of as being a journalistic outlet, but is producing journalistic content, talk about their shared struggles in terms of engagement, trust, monetization, responding to technological challenges and so forth, which was an amazing conversation. And Agora is very much kind of at the heart of trying to look at providing fresh research which can shape and inform the work we're doing as educators, but also for funders and for newsrooms, and also promoting kind of new ways of doing journalism. So one of the things we're talking a lot about at the moment is community-centered journalism, the role of listening, of trying to encourage audiences to shape the news agenda so it's more bottom-up rather than top-down.
So why is local news important?
Well, I think there's a number of kind of key factors for that. One of which is, and I think the COVID crisis really kind of exemplified that on the one hand you could have press conferences coming from the White House and you could have CDC information, but what we really need to know is, what does that mean for me locally? What does it mean for the decisions I'm going to make for me, for my family, for my work, and so forth. And local media is the conduit to be able to translate that into something that is pertinent to your lives. So that's kind of like the first element. The second thing that I'm really keen on, and I've written a little bit about, is to talk about the role that local media can play as a proxy for the wider journalism industry. So you mentioned about kind of falling distrust in journalism and so forth. And I remember as a kid, I would go to events and I would see a local reporter there with their notebook taking pictures and making notes. I got invited to go to, well, my whole class did, to go to the local paper, and we saw how they were printing it, and we saw how they did layout, and we kind of got to understand that process. For many people, a local journalist is the only journalist they will ever meet. So that by proxy, therefore becomes the conduit by which you judge an entire industry. And local journalism plays such an important role in not just providing news and information that is useful for people's day-to-day lives, but also explaining news literacy, how the news works, and giving people a positive experience of the media and journalism, which hopefully will then translate to a better perception of the industry as a whole.
It's also, though, been a period where local media has
Been
shrunk.
decimated.
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, the Register Guard used to be a local family-owned paper. It is no longer that.
Yes.
So speak a little bit about that.
Yeah, that's one of the biggest challenges that we have seen in the US, has been the emergence of sort of hedge fund-owned news outlets, including some that have been in families like the Register Guard for over a century. And it's pretty fair to say that the goals and ambitions of the owners have changed, and we've seen that in the journalism that's being produced. And that's a real challenge for sure. You know, these papers, and we're mostly talking about papers, but they tend to be a lot thinner than they once were. They're not necessarily publishing every day. They tend to have less experienced staff, and those staff are having to produce a volume of content and stories that is far greater than it ever used to be. And that has an impact in terms of the breadth of stories they can cover, the range of sources that they're able to speak to, and so forth. So, you know, there is that reality. At the same time, we have a very robust public media system, in particular through PBS and NPR affiliates, which is something that I'm very passionate about. But also, it's never been easier than to create your own work. And that's been one of the kind of profound changes, if you think back to sort of when I started out 25 years ago, how hard it was to produce content. You required incredibly expensive equipment. You usually had to have some sort of license to be able to broadcast. Now anybody can set up a WordPress blog or a Tumblr, or set up a podcast or a YouTube channel, a Substack newsletter, or any combination of those things, and create their own media entity. And that's really exciting. I mean, what we've seen is a democratization of the media, which has allowed 1,000 flowers to bloom.
So you mentioned NPR. I know that you are involved with a local NPR station. So tell us a little bit about your engagement with KLCC.
Yeah, so I'm very fortunate that I'm a member of the board for their foundation, and that is really designed to raise money for staff there and to expand its local news provision. I think one of the things that the station has realized is that there is a hunger for local news, and that as we see other outlets that have historically kind of covered it in depth pull back a little bit in terms of the breadth and depth of reporting that they're doing, that's a business opportunity for them. And so there's opportunities to tell stories from the coast, from timber communities, from other places that might not necessarily be covered as much as they have been, or areas like business, for example. We've got this fantastic business podcast, Oregon Rainmakers, that's been launched over the last year or so. There's a ton of stories to be told. We just need the resources to tell it. And so a lot of my work is really involved in supporting those efforts to stress the importance of why this matters, reiterate the importance and credibility of the work that KLCC does, and encourage people to support that. And I think that's really important, that if we believe that journalism matters, we need to put our hands in our pockets and pony up. And it goes back to kind of a question about, well, what kind of society do you want to live in? Do you want to live in a society where you have access to a wide variety of different news from a number of different sources that are credible and telling stories that are relevant to you? If you do, and you're able to, you need to be able to support that. And that's not just for your own benefit, but also for the wider community that you're a part of.
So much of what you've been saying to me today is a kind of demystifying about the media. And it turns out that you You have organized a demystifying media series at SOJC. So tell us about that series.
Yeah, so that started in my second term here in January 2016. And it really stemmed from a recognition of the fact that this is a landscape that's changing incredibly fast, incredibly quickly. And Eugene is a wonderful, beautiful, small town, but that's the thing, it's a small town, it's not a big media market. So you're not necessarily going to bump into people who are kind of at the cutting edge of this industry kind of day in, day out, in the way that you would do if you were in London or New York or Los Angeles or elsewhere. So we have to find ways to bring that conversation to us. And so that was really the goal of that series, and remains the goal of that series, to bring in leading media scholars and leading practitioners from a variety of different places. We've had people from NPR, from Facebook, from universities like George Washington, UVA, University of Virginia, and elsewhere, to talk about their research or to talk about the work that they're doing in terms of content creation and kind of strategies behind that, and use that to inform our work in terms of research opportunities, potential partnerships, what we teach in the classroom, and also to show guests who come here, and often, particularly if you're coming from the East Coast, we're asking for 3, 4, maybe 5 days of your time to be with us, to also show them some of our expertise in terms of what we're doing in terms of our research work, the cutting edge work we're doing in terms of our pedagogy in the classroom, and also to perhaps change and shape or reshape perceptions of students. I mean, we've seen cases. There was a notorious tweet a few years ago of somebody at the New York Times who basically said, these are the top journalism schools and I will only look at these places for people for internships. And they rightly got lambasted for that. But I think there is that kind of perception. And so getting these kind of industry leaders in our classroom with our students then helps them to realize, we have many students who are on a par with their peers at Columbia, Northwestern, Northeastern, Mizzou, and any number of other places. And so it's also not just a great opportunity for us to download from people doing amazing work in industry and the academy, but also for them to leave Eugene and leave Oregon with a very positive and enriched knowledge and experience about what we're doing here at the SOJC and at UO.
So let's speak a little bit about what we're doing here at the SOJC. So in addition to being a journalist, a scholar of the profession of journalism, you are a teacher.
Yes.
Tell us about a course that you teach, or a couple of courses that you teach in SOJC.
Yeah, so one of the courses I'm teaching this term, which I really love teaching, is called Social Media for Journalists. And it kind of stemmed from, it originally started as a course that I did for study abroad, for GEO, for students in London. And it kind of stemmed from a recognition of the fact that our students have grown up with social media and digital technology in their pockets, but they're not necessarily thinking about how to use that as beyond their kind of circle of friends or their family. How do they use that to tell stories that are relevant to brands or to newsrooms or to PR companies? And so that course kind of looks at their digital footprint. It looks at how trends are changing. So we will do things like, well, for example, this term I'm getting my students to make a TikTok resume. We know TikTok has this enormous growth. It now has more than 1 billion users around the world. It's a platform that if you're a Gen Z journalist or content creator, people will expect you're proficient with this platform. And about half my students are, half are not. So it forces them to kind of use this platform, if you like, but also to do so in a way that is useful and helpful to them. How can they, in 30 seconds, in a short form video, sum up their personal brand to the outside world? And it's a really fun assignment to do.
So Damian, we're out of time. I want to thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us. It's a fascinating conversation. Thanks for doing what you do, and I hope you keep doing it.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me.
I've been speaking with Damian Radcliffe, the Carolyn S. Chambers Professor in Journalism at the University of Oregon. Thanks so much for watching.